And we're back. For those of you just tuning in, I'm Matt Shadbolt, and tonight we've invited a distinguished panel of guests to join us for a spirited discussion of Peter Singer's seminal paper on animal equality. Are humans greater than equal when it comes to the food we eat? What's the moral difference between them and us? And why is it okay to eat some animals and not others? We'll hear arguments for and against the moral equality of animals from our guests Sarah Shaw and Mark Sudell, before exploring our guest Malachi Shears' thoughts on whether eating animals is actually the best thing for everyone, where our panelists will be invited to refute some of the claims made. And finally, our guest Ayah Gouda will ask, why is it okay to eat some animals and not others? So let's jump right in. First up, we're going to hear from Sarah Shaw, who comes to us tonight live from the Jersey Shore. Sarah, we're thrilled to have you with us tonight, so help us get our hands around the discussion. Are animals truly morally equal to humans?
Hi Matt, and thank you for having me here today. There's no denying that humans and animals differ greatly. Many would say because of this variance, conversations about agency and equal rights should be non-existent. The exciting thing is that in 2022, this is a conversation that is more alive now than ever. It's a constant battle between philosophy and in-grounded theory research. Do non-human animals possess agency? Up until the last decade, the majority of researchers I work with would have said Mr. Fluffy was snuggling up next to you only to get some tasty treats. What has been found is that many animals have a moral compass. They feel quite deeply, in fact, real emotions such as love, grief, anger and even empathy. A philosopher out of the University of Miami, Mark Rowlands, published a book some years back on research that answers the question, can animals be moral? The findings suggest heavily that social mammals such as rats, dogs, and monkeys, can make the decision to be good or bad. It's because they have this morality, humans should have a moral obligation to them. These animals possess agency. This also extends out to marine mammals. We have seen them grieve with one another for weeks on end after losing one of their family members. We also have seen whales take narwhals under their supervision so that they can develop the instincts needed to survive in the water. They exemplify a deeply caring nature about them that is quite easy to see that there aren't just feelings present, but that there is a cognitive process therein which they use to make moral decisions.
But Sarah, let me ask you something. What about the role of agency? Isn't that morally important here too?
I think so, yes. Agency has long been regarded as morally significant property, something that makes human lives valuable. It's also something that is thought to entitle one to certain rights and privileges. The ongoing question is, what rights should animals have if they possess agency, which we are seeing more and more that they do. There is a question of, is everyone, both human and non-human animals equal? I think this is a complicated question, with an even more complex answer. It's one I am sure will be touched on by all of us here today in some way. I'll say that in my grounded theory research of animal emotions, I've conducted many studies comparing the similarities on how animals and humans are alike, as well as how they are different. The simplest way to answer the question of equality is saying that there are millions of similarities and differences, but animals are not a one-to-one comparison to humans.
But Sarah, forgive me for interrupting. Do you think that's actually true though?
No, what I think is the most appropriate answer is that each one of us on this earth make a contribution to the society we live in our own unique ways. We each, humans and animals alike, possess knowledge, gifts, and a destiny that is different in comparison to our other earthly members. I think it is high time there is an embrace for our differences and recognizing the valuable roles we all play on this earth, such as what lessons can we all learn from one another. Equality is a moral idea, not an assertion of fact. Another philosopher's work that I reference sometimes is Peter Singer, a professor of moral ethics at Princeton University. In his famous essay, All Animals Are Equal, he unabashedly states, it is an implication of this principle of equality that our concern for others and our readiness to consider their interests ought not to depend on what they are like or on what abilities they possess. The point Singer tries to drive home is the interests of the being and that they must be extended to all beings, human or non-human. One of the last points that I would like to talk about, before I turn the mic back over, is every bit of evidence in the scientific community supports that animals are able to experience physical pain equally to the level of human pain. There is no scientific argument that they feel less than we do. In fact, many animals have senses that are much more aware than humans. The main thing that sets humans and animals apart is a developed language. Humans at times struggle to find the exact words to describe how they are feeling, but animals even more so, there are no words. Because of this, there is a large misunderstanding surrounding the full capacity of animals. Both human infants and children are not developed enough to use language in the same way an adult can. Something astounding that can be seen between children and adults, and animals and humans is that there is an understood non-verbal language that we can communicate through and adapt to, filling in the blanks where there may be words.
That was wonderful and incredibly insightful. Thank you so much, Sarah. So we've heard one side of the argument in favor of animal equality, but let's also acknowledge that not everyone thinks this way. Here to argue against the moral equality of animals, and coming to us from beautiful Glenside, Pennsylvania, is Mark Sudell. Mark, thanks so much for being here with us, but help us understand a bit more here. What are your thoughts on what Sarah shared?
Thanks, Matt. Happy to be here. Look at your dog, or your cat, perhaps another pet you may have. Do you believe you are equal to them? The subject of whether animals are truly morally equal to humans is interesting and intriguing. Despite which side you are aligned with, I believe animals are not truly morally equal to humans, and here is why. First, most if not all animals lack the cognitive capacity to be considered humans or aligned with personhood. Let me expound on this using the principle of equality. I was reading Peter Singer's All Animals Are Equal, and the chapter acknowledges the definite differences between animals and humans, a fact that determines their rights within a given spectrum. Using a man and a dog as an example, the article argues, since a man cannot have an abortion, it is meaningless to talk of his right to have one. Since dogs can't vote, it is meaningless to talk of their right to vote. What does this statement mean? It means that the basic principle of equality governing a dog and a man are different intrinsically and in an application. Therefore, there is absolutely no way we can treat a dog and a man the same way.
But Mark, don't you think that equality means treating all animals the same as us?
On the principle of equality, it is significant to realize that equality does not mean identical treatment. Rather, it means equal consideration. Equal consideration means that different beings will experience different rights and different treatment. Allow me to elaborate using the case of lobster as presented by David Wallace in his 2005 article, Consider the Lobster. In the article, Wallace focuses on the central importance of lobsters in the Maine Lobster Festival. Despite lobsters' central role in the festival, they are cruelly killed for the crowd's enjoyment and for the festival to be considered a success. Do I support boiling the lobster alive for the pleasure of the guests? No. However, the article has deliberated on different less monstrous ways to carry out the activity. Hence, we should embrace equal consideration toward animals since it is almost impossible to grant them equal rights.
The argument's fascinating, but I'm not sure I follow you when you describe equal consideration this way. Can you talk a little more about what you mean by that?
Sure. There is no principal way to distinguish between animals that should be primarily approached as animals and those that should be characterized as being human-like. This complex matter extends to the courtrooms and is not a matter of societal standards. How should a judge determine that a dog is more human-like than a cat, or that domesticated parrots should be allowed in the wild like African crows? It is almost impossible to determine which animals are more closely linked to humans or portray more human-aligned characteristics. I came across an interesting quote from Famous Trials, The Case Against Personhood, where Richard Epstein argues that, if the legal wall between animals and humans is broken through, that will open a floodgate of expansive litigation without a meaningful standard for determining how many of the billions of animals in the world are intelligent enough to merit personhood. Epstein tries to expound on the issue of equal consideration, even when approaching animals and deciding to label some more human-like than others.
But don't some supporters argue that human cognitive ability makes us above all other animals?
Although supporters may argue that cognitive ability does not make humans more intelligent or valuable than other species on Earth, it is essential to acknowledge the cycle of life. Some animals indeed have higher cognitive abilities compared to humans, such as octopus whose intelligence is considered extremely high. The question we should ask ourselves is whether being intelligent or rather, possessing a higher cognitive ability should be the mark on which humanhood is founded and driven. In my opinion, I believe in the cycle of life. Lions must feed on other animals since they are carnivorous, and humans need to feed on other animals as we are omnivorous. I will, however, insist on the principle of equality and the concept of equal consideration in our treatment of animals.
Thank you, Mark, for such an illuminating contrast to Sarah's argument. Your discussion of the carnivores feels like a good moment to bring in our next guest, Malachi Shears, an expert in the ethics of food, and who's going to address the elephant in the room. Malachi, is eating animals really the best thing for everyone?
Thanks, Matt. Let's focus our attention on animal protein. But how does animal protein relate to which consumption practices are best for everyone? When determining if eating or not eating animals is best for everyone, remember a common requirement amongst all human beings and many species types is protein. This essential nutrient is mandatory for the human body to be operative. While adopting a carnivorous diet is not the only existing source of protein, many species types and human individuals have a limited selection of their sources of protein. The source from which one receives their protein is not always a result of decision-making, but instead a result of the protein sources one has access to.
But who are you talking about when you say, everyone, here?
In this example, everyone includes all non-human animals and all humans. Considering that all humans are included in this categorization, let's return to the question of, is eating animals the best thing for everyone? Going without a source of protein would not be optimal nor acceptable for a human's physical health. Kwashiorkor, the clinical diagnosis of severe protein malnutrition, is a leading cause of death and severe sickness amongst many humans and disproportionately affects humans living in Southeast Asia, Central America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. At the national level, a study performed by the Emergency Nutrition Network discovered that kwashiorkor is most prevalent in Malawi, Haiti, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Zambia. Alvarez et al., 2016. In particular, Haiti has ranked in the list of kwashiorkor-affected nations and is bordered by the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea.
But what about the role of speciesism here? Isn't that ultimately the same thing as racism or sexism, and therefore objectionable?
An additional point to support that it is best for everyone to allow animals to be consumed is realizing that many arguments against that are for the opposing view are specific to an exact species. Singer argues that speciesism is directly comparable to racism or sexism. Acts that have occurred in history indubitably prove that Singer's comparison of speciesism and racism is not rational. The histories that are associated with racism and slavery are motivated by the intentional perpetuation of malicious intentions to face a continual struggle for one's entire enslaved life. In the case of an animal being slaughtered to be consumed by humans, the animal is not enslaved with the intention of its abuser to sustain its existence to prolong its grievance throughout its life and at its death. Nor is it the case that an animal intended to be slaughtered to be consumed is objected to unfair treatment solely because of its race. Moreover, Singer's theory is supported by his belief that the widespread adoption of speciesism would produce inequality. The comparison of speciesism to racism is additionally not able to be rationally equated due to the historical and physiological differences that exist between animal to animal and human to human. Furthermore, while many argue against speciesism, the fair treatment of all species cannot be truly enforced until all species are fairly treated. As an example, the same hazards that affect animals do not affect humans in the same way. Most humans would consider a plastic straw or plastic bottle cap to be an unthreatening item. However, it is likely that a fish may regard plastic waste as a choking hazard that can ultimately lead to their death.
Sorry Malachi, I just don't agree. Don't we need to continue to eat animals in order to survive? And what's the end game here? No natural protein in our diet at all?
Singer's theory is inadequate to even address various species based on the different hazards that are specific to each species' respective environment and physiological makeup. According to the Census of Marine Life, while there are expected to be approximately 8.7 million species, only a fraction of that number has been described. Considering that there is not a comprehensive list of all described species and their particular hazards, it is not able to deduce that each animal can and is being treated fairly. Thus, it shows that it cannot be verified that the basic principle of equality is not being violated. Until it can be verified that each species' equality is not being violated, the theories that Singer relies upon should not be utilized to determine if or if not eating animals is best for everyone.
Thanks, Malachi. Sarah, let's go back to you, as I know you've done some interesting work on this in the past, but I suspect you don't agree either.
Thank you, that was thought-provoking, even if perhaps not my shared view. I think times are different now. We as a society have evolved. We are now more aware than ever before that animals are sentient beings. Not only are they capable of feeling a variety of emotions, but we also know that they experience suffering and pain. Years ago, humans ate meat to stay alive. We didn't know the ramifications that it would have on our environment, our health, and I'd even go as far to say our conscience. We do now. We know the harmful effects meat consumption can play on our health and what it does to the environment. We also know that the conditions in which animals are raised for the sake of consumption are not always humane.
Let's think about the experiences of animals for a second here. Inhumane doesn't feel like it nearly covers it. Aren't there environmental concerns here too?
When we look at the global picture and ask ourselves, is eating meat what is best for everyone, how can we say yes? It certainly isn't a positive experience for the millions of lives of animals. It might be appetizing to humans, but it is now no longer necessary. Now knowing that a large percentage of greenhouse gas emissions comes from the livestock industry, it certainly isn't great for our increasing problem of climate change. Reducing or even eliminating the consumption of meat would improve human and environmental health dramatically. In making the decision to not eat meat, we would increase the total amount of goodness in the world. If more or all people were vegetarian, there would be no demand for meat. If there were no demand for meat, no one would raise and kill animals for food. There are other options to have a balanced, delicious, and much healthier diet out there.
Would you agree though that there's still a moral justification for eating meat?
How can we morally justify eating meat? One argument that is frequently thrown out there is the hypothesis that animals do not have sentience, at least not on the same level as humans do. But, research disproves that animals don't have sentience. In fact, research has proved over and over that non-human animals do indeed feel similar emotions that humans feel. Charles Darwin in his early research wrote, "There is no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in the mental facilities. We knew this early on, it's just that humans have chosen not to see it." For if humans believed that animals were deeply feeling beings, would we be having this conversation right now?
I think Singer talks about this, right?
That's right, Mark. In All Animals Are Equal, he says, the overwhelming majority of humans take an active part in, acquiesce in, and allow their taxes to pay for practices that require the sacrifice of the most important interests of members of other species in order to promote the most trivial interests of our own species. That's exactly right. Humans all too often do what serves them, what may be easy, the norm, and without asking questions. It is this behavior though of not critically thinking about the consequences that has caused us to be an over-consuming culture and hurt our planet's environment immensely. If we could get away from the ideology of the sanctity of human life, of being sacrosanct, and think of the whole global picture, there would be a harmony unlike no other we have experienced. There would be a learning curve, but it is possible to achieve. If we begin to have moral concern for non-human animals and cease to treat their lives as expendable for whatever reasons, this would bring further goodness to the world. In any case, my argument is to reduce the amount of suffering in this world as much as we possibly can, within our reach. This is one way that we can do that.
Thanks so much, Sarah. We've been talking about animals fairly broadly here, and I want to touch on something Malachi brought up around individual species, and bring in our final guest Ayah Gouda this evening to help us get a bit more specific. Ayah, I read your book on this recently and found it fascinating. Can you help us understand your thoughts on why we often feel it's okay to eat some animals and not others?
Thanks, Matt. Happy to be here, and thanks for having me. Why is it considered permissible to eat certain animals and refrain from the consumption of others? Are we unconsciously segregating between an animal whose consumption we see as morally acceptable and another whose consumption would be immoral? If so, on what grounds do we base our decision on what to eat, and how valid is our decision? Today I will consider the definition of animal and the boundary line that separates the consumable from the non-consumable. Next, I will discuss the reasons that guide us to sometimes extend the traditional definition of which non-human animals are considered non-consumable. Last, I will argue that we cannot specify a single universal ethical reason to avoid eating certain non-human animals due to the individuality of our moral food choices. An animal is a living organism that feeds on organic matter, typically having specialized sense organs and nervous system and able to respond rapidly to stimuli. A scientific definition would further classify animals into groups and subgroups such as mammals, birds, amphibians, etc. For the purposes of this argument, I will claim that an animal is any human or non-human living organism that is not a plant. If we take this simple description as valid, and if we also take the fact that humans are capable of consuming animals as valid, then we come to the conclusion that humans are capable of consuming any animal, including other humans.
But you must agree that's highly frowned upon, right?
Since human consumption, or cannibalism, is frowned upon in most modern societies, we may deduce that while we have the capability of human consumption, we consider it unacceptable or immoral to eat our fellow humans. In other words, we refrain from consuming our contemporaries, and, instead, consume animals of lesser moral and intellectual capabilities. If we take the previous claims to be true, then the boundary line that separates the consumable from the non-consumable is the moral standing of animals. While humans are capable of making moral decisions, non-human animals are not. As a result, it is widely accepted that mammals, birds, and fish are food, but humans are not, even though they are all classified as animals.
You've done some wonderful work on how the consumption discussion intersects with religious ritual, especially around what is or isn't permissible. Can you explain a little more about how you see this for us?
Sure. Although most societies would refrain from human consumption, much dissonance is seen between religions, races, ethnic groups, and individuals on which non-human animals may be morally consumed. For instance, according to their religion, Muslims are forbidden from consuming pork, or any foods manufactured from parts of a pig, such as marshmallows made using pig gelatin. To this religious group, eating a pig is morally unacceptable. Likewise, some Jews might refrain from eating non-kosher meats, as they would consider it morally unacceptable. However, other religious groups may consider pork consumption or eating non-kosher meats perfectly acceptable. Here, we see how humans might refuse to eat certain animals on a religious basis. Race and culture also play a role in the decision of which non-human animals are fit for consumption. For example, the French cuisine is well known for serving frog legs as a delicacy. However, the American public may consider consuming frog legs as morally unacceptable on the mere basis of cultural differences. I infer that culture is the driving force towards choosing whether or not to eat frog legs based on the assumption that not all people of French nationality consider it morally acceptable to eat frog legs and that not all people of American nationality consider it unacceptable to do so. Rather, it is simply a matter of culture or the status quo of the given country.
That makes a lot of sense, and I definitely agree with that.
A third basis on which we choose what non-human animals to eat is purely individual. If I have a pet turtle, I may be less prone to consuming a turtle, although my neighbor may consider it ethical to do so. Similarly, if I read in an article that zebras, for instance, are becoming an endangered species, I may consider it my moral duty to avoid eating zebra. Whereas a person in another country who has not read this article or who does not believe that by refraining from eating zebra, he or she would help stop the zebra extinction, might believe zebra consumption to be ethical. In conclusion, I have clarified the universal boundary between consumable and non-consumable animals and offered examples of why we would refuse to eat certain non-human animals based on religion, culture, or individual reasons. Throughout this paper, I have proposed that the moral beliefs which guide our food choices differ from one group of people, and often from one individual, to the next. As a result, we are faced with the difficulty of specifying a single universal moral code that extends beyond the avoidance of human consumption. We are instead forced to examine our individual choices and what the moral basis is that guides them.
Thanks so much, Ayah. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, so it only remains for me to thank all of our wonderful guests this evening. Our thanks to you for tuning in, and we hope we've shed some light on the current moral and ethical discussions around animal equality. Don't forget to join us online right after the show on Canvas, where our guests will be continuing the conversation. See you next time.